Welcome back. Let yourself grow still and let the day quietly slip away. Bit by bit, we'll drift through the quiet story of a song woven through three gentle farewells. Should this help you fall asleep, subscribe, and I'll have another for you tomorrow. The aloes was not a quiet instrument. It was made from two separate pipes of bone or reed, each fitted with a double-blade mouthpiece, and when a player put both pipes to the mouth simultaneously and drew air through them, the sound that came out carried across open ground in a way that most instruments of its era simply could not manage. At a Greek burial procession moving uphill toward a hillside grave at dusk, the aloes player would have walked near the front of the column, slightly ahead of the mourners, so that the sound went out in front of them like something clearing the way. The two pipes produced a tone that was reedy and penetrating, and in the lower registers almost human in its quality. Not quite a voice, not quite a wind instrument, occupying some middle ground that made it feel appropriate for a moment that was itself a kind of middle ground, the space between what a person had been in life and whatever came after. The Greeks had a specific word for the songs sung at burials. They called them thranos. A thranos was not improvised. It had structural features, a particular shape, and it was performed by specialist singers called threnodoi, who were hired for the purpose, brought in the way one might engage a carpenter or a mason, because the work required skill and the occasion required that the work be done correctly. The aloes accompanied the singing as the procession moved, its double pipe sound weaving beneath the voices of the mourners, and the combination of those two sounds, the formal vocal lament above and the penetrating reed tone below, would have reached the ears of anyone nearby and told them, without ambiguity, what kind of event was taking place. Sound, in that context, was not decoration. It was announcement and ceremony and acknowledgement all at once. There is something worth pausing on in the decision to hire specialists for this. The threnodoi were not the family of the deceased. They were not people who had known the person being mourned. They were skilled practitioners of a specific musical and vocal form, engaged because grief alone, however genuine, however complete, was not considered sufficient to carry out the ritual with the care it required. The music needed someone who knew what it was supposed to do and how to make it do that. Across most of recorded human history and across most of the world's cultures, that instinct appears again and again in different forms, through different instruments and different traditions, and it is as consistent as almost anything else the record shows about how people behave at the moment of parting. The double pipe carried its sound ahead of the procession. The dry grasses of the hillside caught a little of the evening wind. The stones of the burial ground were warm from a day of sun, and the light was going off them slowly, the way late afternoon light does on pale stone in the south of Europe, holding longer than seems likely before it finally goes. The mourners moved at the pace that processions move, the pace that is slightly slower than walking, that signals by its own slowness that this passage of time is different from ordinary time and should be understood as such. And the music continued, because in the understanding of those who organized these ceremonies, and of those who attended them, and of the threnodoi who performed them, the moment of arrival at a grave was not something that should be approached in silence. That instinct, the reach toward music at the moment of parting, has left a very long record. It appears in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, in forms that share almost nothing in surface detail, and yet converge in their essential logic, that sound should accompany the goodbye, that music should mark what words alone cannot adequately hold. In the streets of New Orleans, that logic took a particular form that developed across the 19th century and carried something important forward from West African traditions into the specific musical culture of southern Louisiana. The New Orleans Jazz Funeral, as it came to be known, organized the music of farewell into two distinct phases with such clarity that each phase carried its own name and its own role. On the procession toward the burial ground, the brass band played slowly. The trombone moved through the lower notes of familiar hymns. Just a Closer Walk with Thee was one of the standards, a song whose melody has a quality of movement in it, even when played at the slowest possible tempo, as though the tune itself knows it is going somewhere and cannot entirely suppress that knowledge. The musicians in a New Orleans brass band on a funeral procession walked in the specific humidity of a Louisiana afternoon, the sun on the bell of the tuba, the clarinet threading something above the melody, the whole ensemble moving at that measured pace that processions require. Behind the band, the mourners followed. The music was a kind of container for what the walk required, a form that gave shape to the movement between the place where the ceremony had been and the place where the burial would happen, holding the people inside, something organized enough that they did not have to find the shape of the moment on their own. After the burial, the form changed completely. The band would strike up something different, syncopated, quick, the characteristic rhythmic displacement of jazz, and the return journey, the second line, became something that moved in an entirely different direction, emotionally and physically. People danced, spectators joined, the parasols came out. The second line was not a denial of what had happened, but something more intricate, a continuation of the ceremonial acknowledgement of the person's life, expressed now in the register of celebration rather than sorrow, as though the full account required both, and the day was not complete until both had been given. The two phases together formed a whole that neither phase could have constituted alone. That particular architecture, slow and sorrowful toward the grave, released and joyful on the return, reflected something that the tradition had worked out over generations, a knowledge about what the moment of farewell actually contains. It is not only one thing, it is not only grief. It contains grief and love and gratitude and the persistence of the person's presence in the memory of everyone who knew them, and a musical tradition that can hold all of that has to be able to move between registers, not settle into one. The second line was not a surprise or a departure from the seriousness of the occasion. It was the second half of the same serious act, the completion of something the slow dirge had begun. In the front rooms of Irish houses, at wakes that might last through a night and into the following day, a different song found its place with comparable consistency. Danny Boy has a melody that predates its most well-known set of lyrics by a considerable stretch. The tune known as the Londonderry Air was already in circulation when Frederick Weatherly, a British lawyer and lyricist, set his words to it in 1913. What Weatherly wrote was not a standard love song or a simple lament. The lyrics are spoken by someone addressing a person who is leaving, going to war, or simply going away, and there is a verse in which the speaker acknowledges that they may not be alive by the time the other person returns. "Come back," the song says, "when summer's in the meadow, and if I am gone, as I will be gone, you'll find me in a quiet place, and you'll know that I am there with you, and it will be all right." The structural peculiarity of that, a farewell song in which the farewell is spoken by the person who may already be dead, addressing someone who has not yet come back, gave the song an unusual durability at wakes, where it arrived not as an outside commentary on the situation, but as something almost interior to it. The person who had died might have been the one who would have sung it. The words were already shaped for exactly this space, already written for the room where the absence was, already addressed to someone who who had not yet fully understood what had been lost. When several voices joined on the second verse, not by arrangement, but simply because the words were known, the song did what songs at wakes have always done. It held the people in the room together inside something that was larger than any one of them, and it gave the grief a form. Frederick Weatherly wrote the words in 1913, though the melody is much older, and the song's association with Irish wakes spread across the 20th century until it became, in many communities, essentially inseparable from the occasion. A gathering in a front room, late in the evening, someone taking up the first line, and the room changed. Not dramatically, not with announcement. It simply settled into something it had been moving toward since the evening began. The conversation, and the tea, and the careful talk about the person who was gone, finding its natural continuation in music, the way water finds the low part of a landscape. There are songs that carry the history of a particular moment with them so completely that hearing them in any other context is almost disorienting. The melody arrives bringing too much with it, more than the room expected. Taps is one of those. It is a short piece, 24 notes, arranged in a call that ascends and then descends, the whole melody resolving in under a minute when played at the standard ceremonial tempo. Union Army General Daniel Butterfield composed it during the summer of 1862, working from an earlier bugle call, adapting the notes into something that felt right as a signal for lights out, the sound that told the soldiers in camp that the day was ending and it was time to sleep. It was adopted almost immediately by both sides of the Civil War, as the call played at military funerals, and that use persisted with such consistency that the notes themselves came, over generations, to carry the weight of everything they had accompanied. Under Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 1491, taps is now required by law to be performed at the funerals of all eligible veterans. The requirement can be met with a live bugler, and where a live bugler is not available, a recording may be used, but the call must be present. The language of the law preserves what practice had already established over more than a century, that this particular sequence of 24 notes belongs specifically and legally to the moment of military farewell. A bugler at the edge of a military cemetery, at dawn, the white headstones in rows across the field, still catching the low morning light. The first note sounding, and then the rest following in their particular arc, ascending toward the highest note the call reaches, then descending again, the last note held for a moment before it releases into the open air. What is notable about taps in its full history is how completely the melody absorbed its ceremonial meaning and then became impossible to separate from it. There is nothing in the musical material of the call, its intervals, its rhythm, its key, that inherently compels sorrow. The same melodic structure could have been assigned a different occasion and accumulated different associations over time, but it was assigned this occasion, and it was played at this occasion thousands of times across more than a century and a half, and now the two things, the melody and the moment, are effectively the same thing. A person who has heard taps played at a military funeral, or even who knows what the call is, and when it is played, cannot hear those 24 notes without that knowledge coming with them. It does not take the scale of a military ceremony or the organized formality of an ancient Greek procession to produce the same impulse. On the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, as the RMS Titanic foundered in the dark and cold water, 8 musicians continued to play. Wallace Hartley was the bandmaster. He was a violinist from Lancashire who had worked on ocean liners long enough to understand what the job required, not only the formal duties of providing music for the first-class passengers at dinner and at the various social occasions the voyage required, but also the less defined duty of maintaining, through music, some quality of normalcy in moments that might otherwise become disorderly. He and his 7 fellow musicians had been playing that evening in the first-class reception area on D-Deck, conventional salon music for a conventional shipboard occasion, and then the ship had met the iceberg at 11:40 in the evening, and nothing about the situation was conventional anymore. Multiple survivors placed the band on deck in the ship's final hour. Harold Bride, the wireless operator, reported hearing them playing as he worked to get distress signals out. Others, making their way to the lifeboats or already pulling away across the dark water, described the music continuing as the ship listed and the deck tilted and the lights were still on. The question of what they played in those last minutes has not been definitively resolved. Whether they played Nearer My God to Thee or something else has been examined extensively by researchers at the Titanic Historical Society without arriving at a settled answer. What is agreed across the weight of survivor testimony is that they played. The decision to continue, with the deck sloping under their feet and the lifeboats already moving away, was made and then carried out, and the music continued. No one recorded what Hartley said to the other musicians, or who spoke first, or whether anyone spoke at all. The record stops at the fact of the music and the moment in which it sounded. What the survivors remembered was the playing, the sound continuing in the cold air over the water, and the particular quality of that, the familiar form of music persisting inside a situation that had left everything familiar far behind. A string quartet, a ragtime band, a ship's orchestra, whatever the combination was playing, and whatever they were playing, the music carried outward across the water toward the lifeboats, and the people in those lifeboats heard it, and that detail lodged in their accounts with a specificity suggesting it had been important to them in a way that went beyond the merely curious. That the musicians kept playing is, in most accounts, the detail that stays. It is not the only remarkable thing about that night, and it is far from the most consequential, but it is among the most remembered, which suggests something about what music at the moment of farewell means to the people who are present for it, the weight it carries in memory afterward, the way it concentrates the moment and makes the moment more recognizable as itself. The band played, the lifeboats moved across the dark water, the lights of the ship were visible from the boats, and then they were not. The music had been part of what was left behind, part of what marked the place where the goodbye had happened. A brass band in New Orleans moving at a measured pace down a street in afternoon heat, the trombone in the lower register of Just a Closer Walk with Thee, the trumpet carrying the melody, the percussion keeping the measured step that tells the people behind the band what kind of walking this is. The second line has not begun yet. The band is still in the first phase, still holding the slow tempo, and the people in the procession walk with the particular attention that people give to this kind of walking, the kind in which the movement itself is part of the ceremony and cannot be hurried without losing something that cannot be recovered. The sound moves ahead of them through the street. People on their porches watch. A neighbor who knew the family steps off his porch and falls in at the back of the procession, because in a New Orleans jazz funeral that is something you can do. The procession is not closed to those who want to join it, and sometimes the acknowledgement of a loss is given its full size by the number of people willing to walk. The muted trombone slides between notes in a way that is peculiar to the instrument, and to this tradition, a sound that is not quite a glide and not quite a step, something between the two that gives the melody a quality of grief in the most physical sense of that word, as though the music is not describing grief, but physically enacting it through the mechanism of the instrument. The slide positions and the lip pressure and the muted bell produce a tone that sits in the body of the listener in a specific place, somewhere in the chest, not in the throat, and not in the head, but lower. And the recognition of that physical location is part of what makes the music feel right at the moment for which it was designed. There is a relationship between the acoustic properties of a muted brass instrument at slow tempo and the physical experience of sorrow that is not accidental and is not simply cultural, though it is also cultural through and through. The second line, when it comes, arrives with a force that catches people who have not witnessed it before. The tempo shifts. The mute comes off the bell of the trombone. The drummer moves from the measured funerary beat into something that carries the body differently, and the people who had been walking begin to move in the way that this music requires. The line between the first phase and the second is a specific musical moment, a downbeat, a tempo change, a lift in the collective mood that is almost physically palpable, and crossing that line is understood by everyone present as crossing a threshold. The burial has happened. The slow acknowledgement has been given its full form, and now the second half of the ceremony is beginning, the half that says, the person lived, and the living is worth celebrating, and we are still here, and we are going to move. Weatherly's lyrics for Danny Boy carry within them a very particular awareness of time, not the time of the present moment, but the time of a future the speaker may not survive to see. When the valley's hushed and white with snow, the song says, and that is the moment when the person who has left might return. By then, the singer may be gone. The grave will be there in a quiet place, and you'll find me there, and kneel beside me, and say a prayer, and the singer will hear it, even from that distance. The song is not describing a simple farewell from a living person to another living person. It is describing a farewell extended across the possibility of death, the speaker acknowledging that the goodbye might be the last goodbye, and choosing to speak across that distance anyway. That is why the song has found its particular home at Irish wakes, where the situation it describes, someone gone, someone still here, the address reaching across the space between them, is not a metaphor, but a literal arrangement. The song voices what the room is feeling, from the vantage point of the person who is no longer there to voice it themselves. There is a second verse in which the singer speaks from beyond death, with a kind of direct calm, not with urgency or sorrow, but simply with the assurance that the love persists, and the connection is still intact. And it is this verse that rooms full of people who have lost someone tend to sing the most carefully, the voices holding it with a particular attention, not performing it, but inhabiting it. Several voices joining on that verse without anyone having suggested it, the song simply reaching the point where the room needed to participate. The melody pulling the voices in is something that happens at wakes, and has happened at wakes for as long as the song has been sung at them. No conductor, no arrangement. The words are known, and the moment arrives, and the room becomes the song for the duration of the verse, and then the song ends, and the room is still the room. The tea is still on the table. The chair where the person used to sit is still in its place. But something has shifted slightly. The way things shift when a form has been completed that needed to be completed, and the evening can continue from there. Taps at a military graveside does something different from what Danny Boy does at a wake, or what a New Orleans brass band does at a jazz funeral, but all three are recognizably instances of the same act. They mark the moment. They give it a boundary. They make the goodbye audible in a way that silence cannot make it, and that speech, however careful, however exactly right, cannot quite manage either. Music at the moment of farewell does something that exists in between what silence allows and what words can carry. occupying a register that the human capacity for ceremony has reached toward across recorded time and across every geography the record includes. The 24 notes of taps were not always the call of military farewell. They were first a signal for the end of the day, a practical instruction. The day is over, put out the lights, it is time to rest. That the same call was adopted for the ending of a life. That the bugle notes that told a soldier to sleep came to mean something larger, something final, happened through use and repetition, and the accumulating weight of association, each playing of the call at a military grave, adding to what the notes carried the next time they sounded. By the time the United States Congress formalized the practice in law, it was codifying something that had already become settled through a century and a half of consistent practice. The law confirmed what tradition had already established. These notes belong here, at this moment, in this specific place where someone is being committed to the earth. A bugler at the edge of a military cemetery in the early morning is a sight that has repeated itself across American history for longer than most living people have been alive. The white headstones in their rows are a kind of visual rhythm, regular and extensive, each one a name and a date and a branch of service, the rows going back toward the trees at the far end of the field. The bugler stands at the edge of this, at the edge of the specific grave toward which the morning ceremony has been directed, and raises the instrument, and the first note of taps goes out into the air. The call takes less than a minute. It ascends through the middle registers of the bugle's range, reaches its highest point, the note that has a quality of reaching in it, as though asking a question the remaining notes will not exactly answer, and then comes down in its characteristic arc, the euphonial note, held for a moment before it is released. After the last note, there is the particular silence that follows a single instrument playing alone in an open space, the silence that is not empty, but still carries the shape of the sound that just ended, the air still holding what the air has just been given. At that moment, in that specific quiet, it is possible to do something that is available in very few other circumstances, to sit inside the scale of a single melody and feel how much it carries. One instrument, 24 notes, a melody composed in a summer military camp more than a century and a half ago, and used every time since at the same moment of the same ceremony. The number of times those notes have sounded at that particular moment, at the graveside of a veteran, at the edge of a military cemetery, in the specific stillness that follows the formal conclusion of a burial, is a number that runs into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. Each time, the same notes, the same arc upward and then down, the same held final tone and then the release into air. It is a quiet thing to consider. Not the weight of all that history, not the accumulated grief of all those specific goodbyes, each one particular and unrepeatable and belonging to people who are not present to be named. Only the simpler fact of the melody, going out from one instrument into open air, the same melody each time, the same gesture of marking the moment with sound, the same old human reach toward music at the place where the words stop being enough. The morning light on the white headstones, the rows going back toward the trees, the bugler lowering the instrument, the silence settling, unhurried, into the open field. Deep inside the temporal lobe, in a region the brain does not advertise, there is a small structure shaped roughly like an almond. It sits paired, one on each side, nestled within the folded tissue of the medial temporal region, and it is, by any measure, a quiet-looking thing. Nothing about its appearance suggests what it does in the seconds after a familiar piece of music begins to play, but in those seconds, before any conscious recognition has fully formed, before the name of the song has surfaced, or the memory attached to it has been located and retrieved, the amygdala is already active, already responding, already doing the thing it does with music that carries emotional weight, which is to begin encoding not just the sound, but everything that surrounds it. The amygdala is part of what neuroscientists call the limbic system, a set of structures that work together in the processing of emotional experience and memory. Its specific role in farewell music is not incidental. When a piece of music is heard in an emotionally significant context, at a burial, at a final parting, in a room where something is ending, the amygdala participates in stamping that experience into long-term memory with an unusual degree of permanence. The emotional charge of the moment functions almost like a fixative, binding the music and the memory together in a way that ordinary listening does not produce. A song heard at a departure can be heard 1,000 times before and after that moment, and still the version encoded on that particular day is in some sense different from all the others, set apart, marked, held with a different kind of grip. Researchers who study this process use the phrase effective reinstatement to describe what happens when the music is heard again later. The term is precise and a little dry, the way scientific terms often are when they are trying to describe something that does not feel dry at all. What it means is that the emotional state present at the original encoding is not merely remembered, it is to some degree reinstated, brought back into the body. The music does not just remind the listener of the feeling, it participates in recreating the feeling, or a version of it, in the present moment. The amygdala, recognizing the signal, begins doing again what it did the first time. The process is not metaphorical, it is physiological. This is why a song heard at a specific goodbye does not behave like other songs. It carries something additional, a kind of residue from the moment in which it was first assigned its emotional weight. The weight can diminish over time, and for most people it does, gradually, as the song is heard in other contexts, and the original context becomes less acute. But the encoding does not simply disappear. The amygdala holds what it was given, and the music remains capable, under the right conditions, of returning it. Seated next to the amygdala in the architecture of the brain, and working in close collaboration with it during emotionally charged listening, is a structure called the hippocampus, where the amygdala handles the emotional intensity of an experience. The hippocampus handles something more like its setting, the quality of light in the room, the temperature of the air, the particular arrangement of the chairs, the smell of the flowers, the sound of other voices in adjacent rooms. The hippocampus binds these contextual details together with the emotional content of the moment, creating what memory researchers call an episodic trace, a stored record that is not just emotional but situational, not just felt but placed. When the song is heard again, the hippocampus does not simply retrieve the emotional memory. It reconstructs the scene. The light comes back. The temperature comes back. The arrangement of the room reassembles itself in the mind with a specificity that can seem, when it happens unexpectedly, almost vertiginous. The listener is not thinking of the funeral or the farewell, and then hears the song. The song arrives first, and the room follows, and the person in the room follows, and the quality of the afternoon light follows, all of it in the space of a few bars, before any deliberate act of remembrance has taken place. Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and writer, spent a great deal of time considering this particular feature of musical memory. In his book Musicophilia, which gathered clinical observations from decades of practice, alongside his own experience as a musician and listener, he documented something that has since been confirmed in various forms by other researchers. Musical memory appears to be stored differently and accessed differently from other kinds of autobiographical memory. The specific finding that he documented with particular care involved patients with Alzheimer's disease, in whom autobiographical memory deteriorates in ways that are often severe and disorienting, but who could nonetheless retrieve musical memories with a clarity that other kinds of memory had long since lost. A person who could not recall the names of their children could sometimes recall in full the words of a song they had loved in their 20s. A person who could not place the year or the decade or recognize familiar faces could sometimes sing an entire piece of music correctly without a missed note or a forgotten word. The hippocampus is centrally involved in forming and retrieving episodic memories, and its deterioration in Alzheimer's disease contributes to the erosion of those memories over time. But music appears to recruit additional networks, procedural memory structures, emotional circuits, deeply embedded patterns laid down over long periods of repeated listening that can remain accessible even when the hippocampal pathway is compromised. The farewell song encoded at a graveside, heard at 1,000 other moments across a lifetime, embedded in the emotional and procedural memory of the brain through sheer accumulated repetition, is in some sense distributed across more of the brain than a single autobiographical memory. It has more places to be held, more roots back to the surface. There is a specific phenomenon that grief counselors have noted, and that researchers in music psychology have begun to examine with some care, which involves what happens when a farewell song returns uninvited. The technical term is involuntary musical imagery, a fragment of melody that arrives without being sought and persists without being invited. The informal term is earworm, which is plain spoken and not inaccurate. Elizabeth Helmuth Margulis, a music psychologist who has worked at Princeton, and James Kelleris at the University of Cincinnati have both studied the conditions under which involuntary musical imagery tends to occur. And among their findings is a consistent pattern. Emotionally charged music is significantly more prone to this kind of involuntary return than music heard in neutral emotional contexts. Music that was present at a moment of significance does not stay quietly in the past. It resurfaces. It returns, often at unpredictable times and in unpredictable contexts, without consulting the listener about whether this is convenient. For people in grief, this quality of musical memory can have an early period in which the returning song is experienced as an intrusion, a disruption of the attempt to carry on with ordinary daily life, an uninvited reopening of something painful. A tune belonging to a song played at a burial, recurring all morning in fragments, the same 4 bars looping without resolution, can feel in those early days like an obstacle, something that keeps pulling attention backward to what has been lost. But grief counselors have noted, and some research has begun to support, that this relationship tends to change over time. The recurring melody shifts in character. What was once an intrusion becomes something more like a presence. The 4 bars return, and instead of pulling the listener back to the acuity of loss, they bring something steadier, a kind of continued connection, a thread still running between the person listening and the person who is gone. The earworm does not resolve, but the way it feels to have it resolve changes, slowly, as time passes. The experience of humming a fragment without quite noticing, and then recognizing which song it is and where it came from, this is a feature of musical memory that most people will have had at some point, though not always in the context of grief. The tune arrives partway through the morning, already in progress, as if it had been playing at a level just below attention and has now simply moved upward into consciousness. The piece it belongs to might be identified immediately, or only after some moments of tracing. The occasion it came from, if it came from an occasion, might arrive quickly or hover at the edge of recall for some time before settling. There is something in the quality of this experience that feels like the brain completing a task it started independently without waiting for permission. In 2011, a neuroscientist named Valerie Salampour, working at McGill University in Montreal, published research in the journal Nature Neuroscience that examined what happens in the brain during those moments when music produces what listeners describe as a peak emotional response. The moments that are sometimes called chills or frisson, the sensation of the hair rising slightly and the chest tightening, and the quality of the music seeming to become, for a few seconds, almost too much. What her research found was that these moments produce dopamine release, and that the release occurs in two distinct phases that can be measured separately, each with its own timing and its own neurological address. The first release occurs in the caudate nucleus, a curved comma-shaped structure that sits near the center of the brain and is involved in anticipation and reward prediction. This release does not happen at the moment of peak emotional impact. It happens 2 or 3 seconds before, in the approach to that moment. The brain, having recognized the structure of the music and knowing from prior exposure where the music is going, begins releasing dopamine in anticipation of what it already knows is coming. It leans forward, biochemically, into the moment that has not yet arrived. The reward system is not waiting passively for the experience to happen. It is already moving toward it. The second release happens in the nucleus accumbens, a structure involved in the immediate experience of pleasure and reward, and it coincides with the peak emotional moment itself, the arrival of the phrase, or the chord, or the dynamic shift that produces the strongest response. The brain gets the anticipatory reward of leaning towards something known and beautiful, and then it gets the consummatory reward of the beautiful thing arriving. Two separate dopamine pulses at two separate neurological addresses, separated by a matter of seconds, and yet both belonging to the same few bars of music. What this means, in the context of farewell music specifically, is that a piece of music heard at a significant parting, a piece that produces this kind of dopamine-mediated peak response, is encoding itself into the brain's reward system at the same time as it is encoding itself into the amygdala's emotional memory network and the hippocampus's contextual memory system. It is being laid down in multiple overlapping registers simultaneously. The music is simultaneously a felt thing, a placed thing, a pleasurable thing, and an emotional thing, all of these versions of it being stored at the same time in adjacent but distinct structures, each capable of being accessed by different kinds of later experience. A song that enters the brain under those conditions is entering through more than one door at once, which may be why it stays, the caudate nucleus releasing dopamine 2 or 3 seconds before the emotional peak arrives. This is a small and quiet detail, the kind that takes a moment to settle. The brain is not a passive receiver of music. It is a predictive system using what it already knows about a piece of music to lean into its future moments before those moments have occurred. The anticipation is itself a biological event, measurable, locatable, timed. A person sitting in a room at a memorial service, hearing a piece of music that they have known for years, is experiencing a brain that has already begun moving toward the piece's most emotionally powerful moment before that moment has arrived. The body's response to the music is, in some small but measurable way, happening slightly ahead of the music itself. The hippocampus, in the meantime, is binding the room. It is taking in the temperature of the air, whether it is cold or warm, or somewhere in between, and the quality of the light coming through the windows, and the specific quality of silence between the phrases, and the faint sounds from the street outside, and the arrangement of the other people in the room, and the smell of the flowers on the nearest surface. All of these details are being gathered and held in relation to the music, attached to it, stored with it, so that when the music is later heard in a different room and a different year, the original room will return with it. The hippocampus does not store the music and the context separately and then link them. It binds them into a single episodic trace, so that the music and the room become in memory almost the same thing. This is why the person stopped still in the middle of an ordinary street, caught by a song coming from an open shop window, does not gradually and consciously recall the room they stood in years before. The room comes first, or it comes simultaneously, or it comes so fast after the first bar of music that the sequence is impossible to parse. The shop window and the pavement and the unremarkable afternoon dissolve briefly into a different afternoon, a different room, a different arrangement of light. The hippocampus has not been asked to do this. It is simply doing what it does when the right signal arrives. Research in music psychology has also examined what happens when music is used in clinical settings at the end of life, in hospice wards and palliative care rooms, where patients are in the final stages of illness. The findings, collected in journals including the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, have a quality of quiet specificity that is worth staying with. Music presented at the bedside during a patient's final hours, familiar music, music known from before the illness, has been documented to reduce measurable physiological markers of agitation. Breathing that was irregular can become, in the presence of music, more regular. Pain perception, measured through established clinical scales, is lower when familiar, meaningful music is playing than when it is not. The body's stress response, which in the final stages of serious illness can be elevated in ways that cause distress, is demonstrably lower in the presence of music that the patient knows and has known for a long time. This is not a mystical finding. The mechanism is not unknown. Music, especially music with a tempo below roughly 60 beats per minute, music that moves at the pace of a resting heart, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs the body's capacity for calm and rest. The brain, recognizing a piece of music it has heard thousands of times across a lifetime, is not working hard to process an unfamiliar stimulus. It is receiving something it already knows, something that has been embedded in its procedural and emotional memory across decades, something that requires no effort to understand. The nervous system settles into the familiarity of it. The body follows. Music therapists who work in hospice settings have noted something additional, something that sits at the edge of what can be easily measured, but has been observed often enough to be taken seriously. Patients who are deeply unconscious, or who appear by every external measure to have lost the capacity for response to their environment, sometimes shift in their breathing when a familiar piece of music begins. The breath slows, the visible signs of tension in the face ease, the hands, which may have been slightly contracted, open somewhat. Whether this represents actual conscious hearing or a residual auditory response below the threshold of consciousness, or something else that does not have a precise clinical name, is not definitively established. What is established is that the auditory cortex continues processing sound after many other systems have quieted, and that familiar music in particular can reach these still active networks in ways that unfamiliar sound does not. A music therapist in a hospice room in the late afternoon is doing something that looks from the outside simple, She is sitting in a chair beside a bed, and she is playing, and the room is otherwise quiet, and the light through the window is the particular flat and warm light that comes in the late afternoon in rooms that face west. She has a sense, from watching the patient's breath, of the tempo at which the music is most effective in the present moment, and so she adjusts. If the breathing is slightly faster, the music is slightly faster. If the breathing slows, the music slows to meet it. The technical term for this is entrainment, the tendency of biological rhythms to synchronize with external rhythmic stimuli, and it has been documented across multiple physiological systems, including heart rate, respiration, and brainwave patterns. When the music and the breath begin to move together, the therapist is using a property of the nervous system that works below conscious intention. She is not asking the patient to breathe differently. She is giving the body a rhythm to move toward, and the body, which has been following rhythmic stimuli all its life, follows. There are brain scan studies in which the hippocampus of a person with advanced Alzheimer's disease, a person who may not recognize family members or remember the current year or follow the thread of a simple conversation, lights with clear activation when a familiar song begins to play. The seahorse-shaped structure, named for its shape, curving slightly inward at the top, appears in the scan as a region of warm color against the cooler surrounding tissue, active in the way that structures are active when they are doing what they are built to do. The familiar song has found its way to the hippocampus along pathways that still exist, along routes that the general erosion of Alzheimer's disease has not yet reached. The music arrives, and the structure responds, and the memory held within that structure, the particular encoding of a particular piece of music in a particular room at a particular moment in a life, is still there. Oliver Sacks wrote about patients like this, with a care that balanced precise clinical observation against something warmer. He was interested not only in the neurological mechanism, but in what it felt like from the inside. When music returns someone to themselves in this way, even briefly, even partially, a person who had been absent in the specific way that advanced Alzheimer's disease creates, who had been unreachable by conversation or by recognition of faces, would sometimes become, in the presence of the right music, briefly present, briefly located in time and in self. The return would not last. It was not a cure, and was never described as one, but it was real, and it was repeatable, and its mechanism was not mysterious. The music was reaching neural networks that other forms of communication could not reach, networks that stored the song and everything that had ever been attached to it, networks that responded to the signal regardless of what had happened to the networks around them. This is one of the stranger features of how the brain holds music, that the holding is distributed, spread across multiple systems, so that the loss of one system does not necessarily mean the loss of the music. The procedural memory of a melody, the automatic, almost muscular knowing of where the next note goes, is stored differently from the episodic memory of when the melody was first heard, which is stored differently again from the emotional memory of how it felt, which is stored differently still from the semantic memory of the song's name and its cultural context. When one of these systems fails, the others may still be accessible, the music may still be findable. Not all of it, and not always, but enough to produce the scan image of the seahorse glowing warm in the temporal lobe, enough to produce the slight shift in the breath, enough to produce the return of the person to themselves for a few minutes in the afternoon of what might be a very late afternoon in a very long life. Music therapists in clinical settings spend time learning what music a patient knew in their 20s and 30s, the period when musical memory tends to be laid down most deeply, when emotional intensity is high, and exposure is frequent, and the hippocampus is at its most efficient in binding experience into durable episodic traces. The music heard between roughly 15 and 25 years of age has a particular hold on the memory, a hold that persists through decades of subsequent listening and long outlasts the period in which the music was new. Playing that music in a room where someone is very ill is not a gesture towards sentiment. It is a clinical decision grounded in the specific knowledge of where the music is stored and how the brain continues to access it. The specific tempo of a piece of music heard in such settings matters in ways that go beyond clinical protocol. Ethnomusicologists have noted that mourning and farewell music across many unconnected cultures tends to settle at tempos below 60 beats per minute, at or below the pace of a resting heart. This is not a coincidence of cultural taste. The nervous system does not distinguish between music played at a cultural ceremony in one part of the world and music played in a clinical room in another. It responds to tempo as a physical event, synchronizing its own rhythms toward whatever rhythmic stimulus is present. A piece of music moving at the pace of a resting heart gives the body's rhythmic systems something to synchronize toward, something slow and steady and undemanding. The body, hearing this, tends to slow, not because it has been instructed to, because the signal has arrived, and the nervous system, which has been following rhythmic stimuli since before birth, responds. There is a quality in all of this that is easier to feel than to state, in which the science describes but does not exhaust. The amygdala encoding emotional charge, the hippocampus binding the room, the caudate nucleus leaning biochemically toward a musical moment it already knows is coming, the nucleus accumbens receiving the reward of the moment arriving, the auditory cortex continuing to process sound after other systems have quieted, the seahorse-shaped structure glowing in the scan of a brain that has lost so much and still holds this, all of these things happening and having happened and continuing to happen, not because anyone designed them to, but because they are what the brain does with music that carries weight. The music therapist's hand on the strings in the late afternoon does something that can be measured and documented and described in the vocabulary of psychoacoustics and neurophysiology, and also something that is simply the presence of one person with a trained ear sitting beside another person and listening to their breath and moving the music toward where the breath is. The two things are not in conflict. The mechanism is real and the presence is real, and they occupy the same room at the same time, neither canceling the other. A person stopped in the middle of a street by a song from an open window is experiencing effective reinstatement, amygdala response, hippocampal reconstruction of episodic context, and the specific neurological weight of emotionally charged music encountered at a moment of significance. All of this is true, and none of it makes the moment less than what it is, the strange, familiar sensation of being briefly somewhere else entirely, in a room that no longer exists, at a moment that is already past, held inside 4 bars of music, playing from a shop window on an ordinary afternoon. Someone humming a fragment all morning without noticing, the 4 bars of a melody from a song played at a funeral, not as intrusion now, but as something steady and companionable and present. This is the brain doing what it does with music that was given significant weight at a significant moment. The hippocampus holding the room, the amygdala holding the feeling, the procedural memory holding the tune itself, the automatic knowing of where the next note falls, available still through every layer of everything that has happened since. And in a hospice room on a still afternoon, a music therapist adjusting the tempo of a piece as a patient's breath changes beneath the warm western light, slowing the music as the breath slows, holding the rhythm in the space between one breath and the next. The brain and the body are still doing what they have always done, still listening, still responding, still following the rhythm outward toward whatever quiet place the music is going, all the way to the end. On a printed form from the Cooperative Funeral Care, somewhere in Britain in the early 2000s, a column of song titles appears in order of frequency requested. The list is practical. It was produced by tallying responses across thousands of service planning consultations, and it was intended to help funeral directors anticipate what families were likely to want. At the top of that list, appearing more often than any hymn or classical piece or folk standard, sits a song first recorded in 1969 by a man from Hoboken, New Jersey, about living life on his own terms and having no regrets about any of it. The song is My Way. It has been there, near or at the top of similar surveys in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia for decades now. The practical fact of its dominance, the handwritten notation of its title on service after service, the matter-of-fact repetition of it across planning forms in towns that have never heard of each other, is, in its own quiet way, one of the more interesting things about it. What a funeral director does with a song title, when it appears on a service sheet for the third time in a single month, is write it down the same way they wrote it the first time. The handwriting does not change. The font on the printed order of service does not carry any particular weight. And yet the song arrives in the room each time as though it is the first time anyone has chosen it, because for the family standing at the front of that room, it is. This is part of what makes farewell music so unusual as a category of human expression. A piece of music can be selected by thousands of different families for thousands of different reasons, can fill thousands of different rooms where thousands of different people are sitting very still, and each one of those occasions is from the inside entirely singular. The frequency documented in the survey data and the singularity experienced in the room are both true at the same time. My Way began its life as a French chanson. Comme d'habitude was written by Jacques Rivaux and Claude François in 1967, and it describes something considerably quieter than triumph, the mechanical distance that had grown between two people in a failing relationship, the routine of a household where love had become habit. Paul Anka, the Canadian songwriter, heard it in 1968 and bought the rights to the melody. He wrote English lyrics that kept almost nothing of the original subject matter, replacing the domestic exhaustion of the French version with a sweeping retrospective delivered by a narrator at the end of a long life. Frank Sinatra recorded the resulting song in late 1968, and it was released in 1969. The transformation between the two versions is large enough that they are essentially different songs, wearing the same tune. The French song is about the slow erosion of something. The English song is about having stood your ground for decades and arrived intact at the end. That arrival quality is probably part of what made it migrate so naturally into funeral use. A song narrated from the vantage point of a life completed, surveying the full length of what has been lived, suits the particular kind of looking backward that a memorial service asks everyone present to do. The narrator of My Way is not young, he is not mid-journey. He is at the edge, looking back, and the posture of the song, the chest-forward refusal of regret, gives the people in the room something to attribute to the person who has died. Whether or not that person ever said anything like those words, the song says them on their behalf. The mourners receive it, in part as a report from somewhere the deceased has just arrived. Survey data from similar research in Australia placed My Way in comparable positions, and funeral industry publications in the United States have noted the same pattern. The song is not a hymn. It carries no specific religious content. It makes no reference to an afterlife. Its theology, such as it is entirely secular. The life was lived, the choices were made, and the record stands. This may help explain its particular reach across communities with very different relationships to organized religion. A song that claims the authority of a life rather than the authority of a doctrine is available to almost anyone. The version most commonly played at funerals is Sinatra's. His baritone in 1969 carries a particular quality of settled weight, a voice that has been in many rooms and is not surprised by any of them, and something in that quality aligns with what the occasion asks of the music. Other recordings of the song exist, and some families choose them, but Sinatra's tends to be the default, the version that was already in the room, culturally speaking, waiting to be selected. Something different happened with a song written in 1788, collected and partly composed by a Scottish poet working in Ayrshire, set to a traditional folk melody, and eventually broadcast by a Canadian bandleader from a New York hotel ballroom on New Year's Eve of 1929 to millions of radios across North America. Auld Lang Syne arrived at its farewell function not through a single decisive moment of selection, but through the slow accumulation of broadcast repetition. Guy Lombardo's Royal Canadians played it at the stroke of midnight each year from the Roosevelt Hotel, and the radio signal carried it into living rooms across the continent. And after enough years of that, the song and the moment became inseparable, not because anyone had decided they should be, but because the association had been made so many times that it had become structural. The song was no longer a choice, it was the thing that happened. Robert Burns collected the poem in 1788, attributing it to an old man, and noting that he had written down what he heard, though scholars have long agreed that Burns also composed portions of it himself. The Scots dialect of the original, Auld Lang Syne, meaning roughly old long since, or the days gone by, sits in the song with a kind of worn domestic warmth, the way a phrase sits that has been used so many times it has rounded its edges. The question at the center of the song is whether old friendships and old times should be forgotten, and the song answers its own question without quite being direct about it. The answer is no, and the way you say no is by raising a cup and drinking together. The gesture the song calls for is fundamentally social. It requires at least two people. It is not a solo expression of loss, but a communal affirmation of continuity. The melody attached to it by common practice is a traditional Scottish air, whose origins are debated, and this combination of uncertain origin tune and carefully assembled lyric is itself characteristic of folk music's relationship to history. Nothing fully traceable, everything fully present. What is traceable is the Lombardo connection. His orchestra's annual New Year's Eve broadcast from New York began in 1929, and the song's position at the heart of the North American midnight tradition can be dated to that broadcast and its decades of repetition. When Lombardo died in 1977, other orchestras continued the tradition he had established. The song by that point did not need him. It had become self-sustaining, held in place by the combined weight of every New Year's Eve on which it had already been played. That Auld Lang Syne is also used as a closing melody in Japanese department stores at the end of the business day is one of the more pleasantly unexpected of the song's many migrations. In Japan, where it arrived through Western musical influence in the Meiji period, the melody became associated with endings and departures across a range of commercial contexts. A customer leaving a shop at closing time might hear the same tune that North Americans associate with the stroke of midnight, stripped of its lyrical content and reduced to pure melodic signal. This is ending now. The day is done. It is time to go. The function is identical, even as the context has shifted entirely. The melody has become, in that setting, a kind of audible door closing. There is a moment in the recorded history of a completely different song when its cultural meaning changed in a single evening and never changed back. Quanto Partiro was composed by Francesco Sartori, with Italian lyrics by Lucio Quarantotto, and it was first performed by Andrea Bocelli at the San Remo Music Festival in 1995. In its original form, the song is about longing, specifically the imagined departure to an unknown place that love makes possible, the idea of leaving behind everything familiar because another person is going with you. The title translates roughly as I will go with you, or I will leave with you, and the song is built around that image of shared departure into something open and unnamed. Later in 1995, the song was played live at a sporting arena in Germany. Henry Maske, the world light heavyweight boxing champion, was retiring from professional competition, and the German broadcast of his final fight included Bocelli's performance of the song as Maske stood alone in the ring. The audience in the arena and the television audience watching across Germany encountered the song at the same moment and in the same emotional context. A man at the end of something, standing still while something large and full-voiced moved through the air around him. By the end of that evening, the song's emotional identity had been remade. It had arrived as a ballad about romantic longing and departed as a farewell anthem, and it has functioned as one ever since. The song was retitled Time to Say Goodbye for its international release as a duet with soprano Sarah Brightman, and in that form it reached audiences far beyond Italy and Germany. But what had happened at the Maske fight was not primarily about the English title or the international release. It was about the moment of live broadcast, the specific coincidence of Bocelli's voice and Maske's stillness, and the crowd's recognition of something ending. That coincidence did not need to be planned. It only needed to happen once, in front of enough people, and the song's meaning would accumulate from there. Each subsequent use of the song at a farewell occasion adds weight to every use that follows, because every person who hears it at a goodbye arrives already carrying the memory of the last time they heard it at a goodbye and the time before that. This layering of association is part of how farewell songs develop their particular density of feeling. A piece of music used at one significant parting is invested in the memory of everyone present with the emotional texture of that moment. When the same music appears at a second significant parting, the emotional textures do not cancel or replace each other, they accumulate. The song becomes, over time and across many uses, a kind of container for the collective experience of goodbye, and people bring to each new hearing everything they have already placed there. Quanto Partiro moved through this process unusually quickly, because the initiating event was a broadcast watched by millions of people at once. What usually happens gradually over decades happened in a single evening. Bob Dylan wrote Knockin' on Heaven's Door for a film in 1973. The film was Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and the song was written to accompany a death scene, specifically the slow dying of a supporting character, a sheriff played by Slim Pickens, while his wife kneels beside him as he fades. The song was written to function within a specific narrative moment, and it does that function well. The lyric is simple and direct, a narrator asking to be unburdened of the symbols of earthly authority, the badge, the gun, because the darkness has grown too heavy and the end is close. For a film death scene, it is exactly calibrated. What happened after the film is that the song escaped its original context entirely. It was covered by hundreds of artists in the following decades, by Guns N' Roses, by Clapton, by many others, and each cover reached a different audience with a slightly different emotional frame. But the song's relationship to the specific gravity of memorial and public mourning was established through a different set of uses. At the concerts held in Dunblane, Scotland, following the school massacre of 1996, the song was performed as part of memorial gatherings, its lyric about being at the edge of departure, finding a use no one had planned for it, when Dylan wrote it in 1973. In the commemorations following the 2015 attacks at the Bataclan Concert Hall in Paris, the song appeared again, played in public spaces among crowds of people who were standing together because they did not know what else to do and needed something to stand around. The reason that Knockin' on Heaven's Door moves between such different contexts, a Western film, a Scottish memorial concert, public mourning in Paris, soldiers' funeral services, is partly the directness of its lyric. There is nothing culturally specific in the image of setting down a burden, because the darkness is gathering and the end is near. The sentiment does not require any particular belief system to receive it. The dying sheriff in the film is a Western figure, but what he is experiencing is simply human, and the song describes the experience in language plain enough that almost anyone can stand inside it. Songs that travel across very different memorial contexts tend to share this quality. They are specific enough to be felt, but not so specific that they belong only to one kind of occasion or one kind of loss. Dylan's voice in the original recording carries a quality of understatement that suits the song's content, the low, slightly rough tenor delivering each line without elevation or urgency, as though the words themselves are enough and do not need to be pressed. The song became a standard at memorial services across many different contexts, not because it was designed to be, but because it was designed to describe something true, and the truth it described turned out to apply to many more situations than a film director's death scene on a Western set. Franz Schubert composed his setting of the Ave Maria in 1825. He was 28 years old. The text he said was not the traditional Catholic prayer of that name, but rather a translation by Adam Stork of verses from Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake, a narrative poem in which a character named Ellen addresses a prayer to the Virgin Mary. Schubert set the German translation as one of 7 pieces, and the melody he wrote is one of the most recognizable in the entire Western classical canon, a long arching line that rises and opens and then settles back, supported by a steady rocking accompaniment in the piano part. The shape of the melody is part of why it travels so readily across different contexts. It ascends and then returns, opens and then closes, and this arc gives it a feeling of completion that does not depend on the listener knowing anything about its text or its composer. At the state funeral of Princess Grace of Monaco in 1982, Ave Maria was performed. At the memorial mass for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis in 1994, it was performed again. At the state funeral of Ronald Reagan, held at Washington National Cathedral in June 2004, a soprano stood at the lectern and sang the opening long note, which rose into the stone vault of the nave, before the rest of the phrase followed it upward. The cathedral is large enough that the melody has room to fully form before reaching the far walls, and in a space that size, the first note of Ave Maria arrives in the upper air before the congregation has finished processing that it has begun. 3 different figures, 3 very different public lives, 3 different kinds of state occasion, one a European principality's Catholic monarchical funeral, one an American memorial mass for a private citizen of great public prominence, one a state ceremony in the capital of the United States, and the same melody present at all of them. The song's capacity to appear at Catholic, Protestant, secular, and non-denominational services with equal appropriateness is unusual and worth paying attention to. Most music that carries strong religious associations is received differently by audiences of different faiths. Ave Maria, Schubert's version specifically, seems to move past this difficulty, or around it, because what the melody communicates is not doctrinal but emotional, and the emotion it communicates is one that the occasion of a major farewell tends to produce, regardless of the theological framework surrounding it. Part of this may be the melody's characteristic movement, that long ascending phrase that seems to open upward before completing itself, which produces, in almost any listener who has heard it before, in a significant context, a physiological response that is prior to belief. The body knows the melody. The body has been in that room before, or in a room where the same melody was playing, and responds to it now without waiting for the mind to catch up. What a funeral program calls Schubert's Ave Maria is, by the time it appears in a cathedral in 2004, carrying the weight of every occasion on which it has previously been performed, at a final goodbye, and the listener in the pew receives all of that accumulated weight at once, in the first measure, before the voice has begun to climb. The soprano's breath before she begins is not recorded in any account of the service, but there is a specific quality to the silence in a large stone building in the moment before a well-known piece of sacred music begins. The audience knows what is coming. The conductor has raised the baton, or the accompanist's hands are positioned, and the room holds its breath collectively in the fraction of a second before the first sound arrives. That fraction is part of the music's effect. The anticipation is already doing something to the air in the room, and what follows is landing in air that has already been prepared to receive it. The stone vault of the nave amplifies and prolongs the first note, and the melody ascends into the upper air of the building in a way that a smaller room would not permit. Outside of state occasions, where Comcodes plant for i betheater the cooks, titkel deaf, because a mini treeling Calvin, and Hungary has pride with medicum, and for that the third quad, the pumpsers plant say cans was prive, and we aids and cheat doubts prive. Ave Maria appears in smaller rooms too, in parish churches with low ceilings and insufficient heating, in crematorium chapels with functional acoustics and rows of pale wooden chairs, in community halls where someone has brought a recording because no live performer was available. In those settings, the melody does the same work it does in the cathedral, though the reverb is different and the air is not so wide. The song is not diminished by the smaller room. It carries its accumulated weight, regardless of the architecture. The 4 songs covered in any detailed survey of farewell music, My Way, Auld Lang Syne, Cante Partero, and Knockin' on Heaven's Door, represent 4 different mechanisms by which an ordinary piece of music becomes culturally assigned to the moment of goodbye. My Way was adopted slowly, through repeated private selection by thousands of individual families making independent choices over decades, until the frequency of those choices made it a default. Auld Lang Syne was fixed in place by broadcast repetition, the same performance going out on the same night, year after year, until the song and the occasion were structurally identical. Cante Partero was transformed in a single broadcast evening by an unexpected coincidence of voice and moment and crowd. Knocking on Heaven's Door migrated outward from a specific narrative function through successive covers and successive uses at successive memorial events. each use adding to the weight of the next. Ave Maria followed yet another path, the slow, centuries-long accumulation of performance at significant occasions across multiple cultures, religions, and political systems, until the melody itself became a kind of shorthand for the gravity of a major farewell. Each mechanism is different. Each produced the same result, a piece of music that, when it begins, tells the room what kind of moment this is. There is a quality that these songs share, despite everything that makes them different from one another. None of them is about death, technically. My Way is about the shape of a life. Auld Lang Syne is about remembering and reconnecting. Conte Partero is about departure into something unknown, shared with another person. Knockin' on Heaven's Door is about the moment of crossing a threshold. Ave Maria is a prayer addressed to an intercessor. What connects them is not that they describe death directly, but that they describe the edge of something, the moment before or after a crossing, the last look back before turning away. Farewell music, it turns out, tends to approach its subject obliquely, describing the space around the departure rather than the departure itself. This oblique approach may be part of what makes these songs survivable to listen to in difficult moments. A song that described death directly, in clinical or literal terms, would leave the listener nowhere to stand. A song that describes the edge, the threshold, the moment of parting, the weight of a long life surveyed, the old friendships not forgotten, gives the listener a place just adjacent to the actual fact of the goodbye, a place where the feeling is fully present, but the directness is not overwhelming. The song holds the space around the loss rather than pointing at the loss itself, and the mourners in the room find that they can be inside the music while the most difficult thing is happening, because the music has given them somewhere to be that is not quite the raw center of it. A funeral director who has written My Way on a service sheet 3 times in 1 month has encountered this pattern often enough to have a practical relationship with it. The song is requested, the song is played, the room responds to it, even when the room has heard it before at another service, even when some of the people present have sat through that melody more than once in contexts of grief. The repetition does not exhaust the song's capacity to work. Each time a familiar farewell song is played at a farewell, it arrives in the specific room as though it has always been heading there. Auld Lang Syne, played at midnight in a North American living room in 1931, and then in 1932, and then in the decades that followed, carries each of those occasions invisibly. A family gathered around a radio in 1 year, and then a different configuration of the same family gathered around a different radio in a later year, and some of the people who were there in the earlier year no longer present in the later one. The song moves through all of that without stopping, the same melody, the same words about remembering and raising a cup. Its function as a farewell song is inseparable from this quality of temporal layering. Every New Year's Eve performance of it is also, for anyone who has been listening long enough, a performance of all the previous ones. Guy Lombardo's Royal Canadians are not the sound that contemporary listeners associate with Auld Lang Syne most readily. The song has been performed in many styles, recorded in many arrangements, played in many rooms since 1929, but the architecture of the tradition that Lombardo's broadcast established, the song at the stroke of midnight, the year turning, the sense of crossing from one named span of time into another, is the architecture that all subsequent performances of the song have inherited. The medium was radio, and radio in 1929 was still new enough that the experience of a signal arriving in a home from a hotel ballroom in New York was itself remarkable, the voice and the melody crossing physical distance in a way that still carried a slight quality of improbability. By the time the technology had become unremarkable, the association between the song and the moment was already permanent. There is a small Japanese department store somewhere, in a city that has no particular connection to Airshare or to the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, where the lights have been dimmed at the end of the business day and the closing melody is playing through the speakers above the escalators. The shoppers moving toward the exits hear it and understand, without needing to be told, that the day has concluded. The melody is the signal. It has been the signal for long enough that no one needs to explain why. The song that a Scottish poet collected from an old man in the 18th century, and that a Canadian bandleader broadcast from a New York hotel, has arrived in that store in a country that had no part in either of those events. Doing a slightly different version of the same thing it does everywhere else it is heard, marking the end of something and signaling the moment of departure, giving the threshold a sound. Henry Maske stood in the boxing ring in Germany in November 1995 as the arena filled with a sound that was not what anyone had planned for his retirement. The song had been chosen, the performance arranged, but the specific conjunction of Bocelli's voice and Maske's physical stillness and the crowd's collective recognition of finality, that conjunction could not have been planned because it depended on a quality of feeling that only happens in the moment. The broadcast cameras were there. The signal went out, and in living rooms across Germany, people watched a boxer standing alone in a ring while a tenor sang about departure into something unknown. And the song that arrived in those living rooms that evening was already a different song from the one that had been performed at San Remo earlier in the year. It was carrying something new. That is how a farewell song accumulates its weight, not through design, but through use, not through intention, but through the specific gravity of the moments in which it has been present. A melody that has been in the room when something ended carries that ending forward into every subsequent room it enters. The mourners sitting in a British funeral chapel, listening to My Way, are sitting in the presence not only of the person they have come to remember, but also of every room in which that song has previously been played at the moment of a final goodbye. The song is older in that sense than any of its recorded versions. It is as old as the first time it was used this way, and it has been adding to itself ever since. The forms this accumulation takes are various. A song can become a farewell standard through private repetition, through public broadcast, through a single televised moment, through a literary or historical association, through a quality of melody that aligns with the physical state grief produces in the body. Some songs arrive at their farewell function through multiple routes simultaneously, the different pathways reinforcing one another until the association is so embedded that the song could not easily be heard in any other context without that context being slightly altered by the weight the song already carries. Ave Maria is perhaps the most complete example of this process. It arrived at its position in the farewell repertoire through the slow pressure of repeated use across 2 centuries and across contexts as different as a state funeral at a cathedral and an amateur performance at a parish church. Its melody makes no argument. It simply opens, ascends, and then settles back, and the room it is playing in becomes, for the duration of that arc, a place where a major farewell is happening. Whether the room is large enough for the melody to fully form in the upper air, or too small to hold anything beyond the sound itself, the song carries its own architecture with it. The stone vault does not make the melody. The melody arrives already, knowing the shape of the space it is meant to fill. A singer standing at a lectern in Washington National Cathedral in the summer of 2004, drawing breath before the first note of Schubert's Ave Maria, is also, in some sense, standing at every lectern where that first note has previously been drawn before, in every room where that ascending phrase has previously climbed toward a ceiling or into open air at the moment of a significant farewell. The song has been there at many of those moments. It remembers each of them in its own way, not with memory as a person has memory, but with the weight of accumulated use, the density of association that builds up in a piece of music when it has been chosen again and again at the most significant moments human beings pass through. The first long note rises from the soprano's voice and travels upward through the stone vault of the nave, and the melody follows it, ascending in the way that melody does when the room is large enough and the occasion is sufficient, and the silence before the first note was held long enough by enough people at once. The phrase reaches its highest point and then begins, slowly, to resolve downward, the arc completing itself the way it always does, with the same unhurried certainty it had when Schubert wrote it, and the same certainty it will carry into the next room where it is played, and the one after that, the melody still moving through the high air of the nave, long after the singer's voice has stopped, the last of the sound settling somewhere above the congregation in the quiet of the stone, still there, still faintly present, in the particular way that a sound remains in a very large room after it has been made, not quite gone, not quite finished, held for a moment longer in the air that received it. On the morning of April 29th, 1975, a radio transmitter somewhere in Saigon broadcast a song about snow. The signal went out over the city in the April heat, over the rooftops in the crowded streets, over the embassy compounds and the private offices, where people were already moving with careful speed, gathering what could be carried and leaving behind what could not. The song was Bing Crosby's recording of White Christmas, made in 1945, and it arrived through speakers and receivers across the city with the warm, slightly distant quality that recordings of that era carry, the voice rounded and domestic, the arrangement easy and slow, the whole thing suggesting a world of fireplaces and cold windows that had nothing to do with the city receiving it. The broadcast was not accidental. It was not a scheduling error or a sentimental choice by a programmer at the end of a long shift. It was a prearranged signal, and those who had been told what it meant were already beginning to move before the last note faded. The operation was called Frequent Wind. It was the final evacuation of American personnel and South Vietnamese civilians from the city, and the signal had been chosen in advance precisely because it was ordinary, a seasonal song, a familiar voice, the kind of thing a radio station might play without occasion. Journalist David Butler documented the detail in his account of the fall of Saigon, and CIA officer Frank Snepp confirmed it in his memoir. The choice was practical. A piece of music that sounded like nothing in particular was more useful than any coded transmission that might be recognized as a coded transmission. And so, on a hot morning in late April, Bing Crosby's voice moved through the air of a city on the edge of profound change, and the people who heard it and understood what it meant began doing what the song was telling them to do. There is something worth sitting with in the specific mismatch of that moment. The song describes sleigh bells and treetops and the brightness of Christmas mornings, a landscape of cold and stillness and anticipated return. The city outside was none of those things. The air was warm and thick and full of a particular kind of urgency that had been building for weeks, and yet the song was doing its job not through its content, but through its form, familiar, calm, unremarkable, carrying its instruction inside the appearance of ordinary comfort. What the signal said, to those who were listening for it, was, "Now, What it sounded like, to everyone else, was nothing special. One of the more considered choices made in the final hours of a very long involvement was to hide the instruction inside a piece of music about home. The evacuation moved through the city by helicopter and by boat through the long hours of that April day, and by the time the last American helicopter lifted from the rooftop of the embassy compound, the song had long since finished playing. The transmitter had moved on to something else or gone silent entirely, but the use of that particular piece of music, its warmth, its familiarity, its suggestion of somewhere else, had done what was required of it. It had named a moment without naming it. It had told people something was over without using the word. Almost 15 years later, on the night of November 9th, 1989, crowds gathered at a structure that most of them had grown up believing would never come down. The Berlin Wall had stood since 1961, and in the years of its standing, it had come to seem like one of those things that simply persisted, too large, too institutional, too deeply embedded in the physical and political geography of Europe, to be moved by anything short of a transformation so enormous it was difficult to imagine. And then, on an unremarkable November evening, the checkpoints opened, and people walked through them, and the wall became something other than what it had been. Among those who gathered that night, witnesses reported hearing Freiheit, a song by the East German band Karat, being sung somewhere in the crowd. The word means freedom in German. The song had been released years earlier, had circulated widely, had acquired its own resonance in the culture, and on that particular night it surfaced from somewhere inside the gathered mass of people and was passed around by voices in the cold air. What is interesting about a crowd singing is the way it happens without coordination. No one announces the song. No one takes account of who knows the words. The melody begins somewhere, from one voice or two voices close together, and then it spreads outward through the crowd, the way warmth spreads, finding the people who recognize it and drawing them in, until the song exists not as a performance, but as a shared breath, a collective act of making sound at a moment when sound is the only thing available that is proportionate to what is happening. The crowd at the Berlin Wall that night was not a concert audience. They were people who had arrived at something they had not expected to arrive at in their lifetimes. The singing, where it happened, was less a celebration than a kind of accounting, a way of measuring what the moment was by filling it with something larger than individual voices. In the weeks and months that followed, the commemorative framing of the wall's fall drew on another piece of music entirely, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and specifically the choral finale, whose text, Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, serves as the anthem of the European Union, was performed at events marking the opening of the border and the process that would become German reunification. The Ninth had been written in the 1820s by a composer who by that point could not hear it, and its final movement had accumulated across the century and a half between its composition and the events of 1989, a kind of institutional weight that made it the obvious choice for moments of collective significance. The Ode to Joy does not express anything specific. It does not name a place or a moment or a political reality. What it does is expand, the melody rising and the voices multiplying and the orchestra widening beneath them. And that quality of expansion made it feel at the commemorative events of late 1989 like the right shape for a moment that was itself difficult to contain in ordinary language. The specific night of November 9th and the formal commemorations that followed were different kinds of goodbye. The night at the wall was immediate and unplanned, a farewell to a division that had felt permanent, marked by the sounds that arose spontaneously from people who found themselves inside a historical moment without having prepared for it. The concerts and performances that came afterward were deliberate. The selection of Beethoven, a considered act, music chosen to hold the weight of something that had already happened and needed to be given a form it could keep. Both impulses, the spontaneous and the formal, were doing the same work, reaching for sound at a moment of parting, finding in music a container for something that resisted any other kind of expression. The BBC announcer who spoke on September 3rd, 1939, cut away from a scheduled program with the particular calm of someone who has been told what to say and has decided to say it plainly. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had addressed the nation that morning, confirming that Britain was at war with Germany. The regional services of the BBC, which had been carrying the usual variety of scheduled entertainment, light music, plays, news bulletins, were suspended. What replaced them was organ music, recorded organ music broadcast repeatedly, filling the airwaves of the nation with the specific sound that most British listeners would have associated with Sunday mornings in stone churches, with services attended out of habit or obligation or genuine devotion, with the particular quality of light that comes through colored glass, with the physical sensation of a building large enough to make a single voice feel small. The choice was, in its way, entirely logical. The country had just entered into something vast and unresolved, and the scheduled programming that had been planned before the announcement, the comedies and dance music and serial dramas, was now not only inappropriate, but somehow impossible. The ordinary texture of life suddenly requiring replacement with something that acknowledged a change in register. The organ music arrived in living rooms across Britain in the way that BBC broadcasts arrived in that period, through sets placed in the corners of front rooms, or on sideboards, or in kitchens, the sound filling the domestic space with something from outside. And the sound that arrived on that particular Sunday morning was ecclesiastical, unhurried, built for large stone spaces, suggesting ceremony and solemnity and the specific gravity of occasions that require acknowledgement rather than entertainment. Millions of people heard it simultaneously in millions of different rooms, each of them receiving the same sonic texture as the first thing the country sounded like at the beginning of a war. It was, in its way, a collective farewell broadcast to whatever the days before September 3rd had been, the peacetime that was now past, the plans that were now rearranged, the normal that was now suspended. And the music chosen to mark that transition was not martial, not triumphant, not anxious. It was slow and deliberate, and slightly ancient, the sound of an instrument associated with endings and beginnings that are taken seriously. There is something in the scale of that moment worth considering quietly. The organ music was practical, in a way, something that could be broadcast without requiring performers to gather and rehearse on short notice, something that was unlikely to cause offense or seem frivolous, something that filled airtime with appropriate weight. But practicality does not fully explain the choice. The selection of religious instrumental music as the first sonic response to a declaration of war suggests that the people making the decision understood, at least instinctively, that what was required at that moment was not information or entertainment or comfort, but something that acknowledged the size of what had just happened. The music did not explain anything. It did not offer reassurance or instruction. It simply occupied the frequency with a sound that was large enough to sit beside a large fact, and that was, in that particular morning, what was needed. The broadcast continued through the day, the organ music recurring between news bulletins, the two things alternating, the factual and the tonal, the information and the acknowledgement of the information's weight. By evening, the BBC had reorganized itself somewhat, but the organ music of that first day remained, in the accounts of people who remembered it, a distinctive and specific thing, the sound the country made when it was saying goodbye to something and did not yet know the full shape of what it was leaving behind. The Titanic carried, in its first-class sections, musicians who had been hired precisely for the purpose of making the ship feel like something other than a ship. The White Star Line understood that the experience of ocean travel, however luxurious the fittings, involved a prolonged encounter with the fact of being at sea, the motion, the confinement, the awareness of deep water below and open sky above, and that music was one of the more effective ways of displacing that awareness with something more comfortable. The orchestra performed in the reception areas, the dining saloon, the lounges, providing the kind of salon repertoire that passengers of the era associated with hotels and concert halls and the general atmosphere of comfortable life on shore. On the evening of April 14th, 1912, before the collision at 11:40 p.m., the musicians were doing exactly that, playing in the first-class reception area on D-deck, the instruments warm and the room full of passengers who had no particular reason to attend to the music beyond its function as background, as the sonic furniture of a pleasant evening at sea. After the collision, the accounts of survivors diverge in their details, but converge in one central fact. At some point, in some arrangement that no one recorded precisely because no one was taking minutes, the musicians reassembled on deck and began to play again. Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster, was among them. The others were Roger Bricoux, John Wesley Woodward, George Crins, Theodore Brayley, John Hume, Percy Taylor, and John Clark, 8 men in total who had been employed to provide comfort through music, and who, in the hours after midnight, continued to do so under circumstances that their employment contract had not anticipated. What the wireless operator Harold Bride later described in his survivor account placed the band on deck in the vessel's final hour, the music continuing while lifeboats were lowered and passengers moved through the cold dark toward them. What they played on deck in those final hours is a question that has occupied the Titanic Historical Society and independent researchers for decades without arriving at a definitive answer. Nearer My God to Thee is the piece most persistently associated with the band's final moments, drawn from multiple survivor testimonies. But other accounts suggest different music, and the question of what the last piece was, the specific melody that moved through the cold Atlantic air as the water rose, has remained genuinely open. The ship went down at 2:20 in the morning. The music, by most accounts, stopped sometime before that, which means there was a moment when the last note was played, the last bow drawn across the strings, and then nothing, only the sounds of the Atlantic and whatever the night held. What that final piece was, no one now knows with certainty, and the record does not resolve it. What is clear is the act itself, the decision, made in the dark on a sloping deck, to continue playing. The decision was made by people who understood their situation and continued anyway, who drew bows across strings and pressed keys and produced music in a moment when music was one of the few things still available that was not a lifeboat. The music they made was a kind of farewell, not delivered to anyone specific, not announced as such, but operating as farewell operates at its most fundamental, the presence of something that acknowledges what is happening without trying to change it, that fills the space between people with sound that is recognizably human, and therefore, in some difficult-to-articulate way, a form of company in the dark. Harold Bride was pulled from the water by the time it was over. He survived. He gave his account, and the account included the band, and the band remained in the record. These 8 musicians playing in the cold of an April night in the North Atlantic, the music moving out across the dark water in the direction of the lifeboats that were pulling away from the ship. What they played in those final hours was conventional music, the kind of thing they had been playing all evening, the kind of thing they knew well enough to play without needing to think about it. The familiarity of the music was probably part of its function, not a dramatic gesture, not a final statement, but simply the continuation of a thing they knew how to do, offered into the night as steadily as they could manage. There are moments in the record of great historical events where the specific human detail, the small concrete particular thing, carries more of the weight of the event than any of its larger dimensions. The 8 musicians on the deck of the Titanic are one of those details, not because their story is separate from the broader event, but because it brings the event into a scale that a person lying in a quiet room can feel rather than merely understand. They played music on a sinking ship. They made sound in the dark. Whatever the last piece was, someone played its final note, and then the music stopped, and whatever came after that was something else entirely. In Moscow, in the summer of 1980, the Olympic Games came to a close on the night of August 3rd in a stadium holding roughly 100,000 people. The 1980 Games had been politically complicated from the outset, with dozens of countries declining to participate in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the previous year. The absence of so many national teams meant the Games had unfolded in a particular atmosphere, large and elaborately staged on one side, conspicuously incomplete on another, and the closing ceremony was itself a kind of farewell to something that had been, in the end, a partial version of what the Olympics was meant to be. The ceremony was nonetheless elaborate and carefully prepared, involving thousands of performers, a procession of athletes, and a mascot, a cartoon brown bear named Misha, who had served as the game's official symbol across the preceding weeks, appearing on merchandise and in the imagery of the event in the way that Olympic mascots do. At the ceremony's culmination, the figure of Misha, inflatable, enormous, wearing a belt in the Soviet flag's colors, ascended into the night sky above the stadium. The ascent was slow. The bear rose above the crowd in the warm August air, growing smaller by degrees as it climbed, the stadium lights illuminating it against the dark sky above the arena. And as it rose, the music playing was Goodbye Moscow, a Russian ballad composed by Alexandra Pakhmutova with lyrics by Nikolai Dobronravov, a song whose title, in the context of the moment, was doing exactly what it said. The song is not a martial piece or a celebratory anthem in the conventional Olympic sense. It is a ballad, the kind of piece that has the shape of feeling rather than the shape of declaration. Its melody moves slowly, and its sentiment is valedictory, the kind of music that acknowledges an ending with a quality somewhere between gratitude and melancholy. In the stadium that night, with the bear ascending into the dark above a crowd of 100,000 people, many of whom had been watching something that none of them would watch again, this particular gathering, this specific incomplete and politically freighted games, this configuration of athletes and nations and years, the song did what ballads do at their most effective. It named the feeling of the moment without explaining it. The accounts of people who were in the stadium that night describe visible emotion in the crowd, people crying, people watching in silence, the enormous spectacle of the ascending bear, and the music filling the open air of the arena, carrying a weight that surprised even people who had arrived without expecting to feel much. Part of what produced that response was the quality of the farewell itself. The closing ceremony of any large international event is a goodbye to something that by definition will not be assembled again in exactly this form. The athletes will return to their countries. The volunteers and officials and support staff will disperse. The stadium will be used for other things. This specific gathering of these specific people in this specific place will end tonight when the bear finishes ascending and the lights come down and the crowd begins to move toward the exits. And the song playing during that ascent was not pretending otherwise. It was acknowledging the ending directly, and the crowd felt the acknowledgement in the way that music makes such things felt, not through the meaning of the words alone, but through the combination of melody and tempo and the particular quality of a human voice singing in a large open space at night. The bear continued to rise. At a certain height, the specific features of the costume would have become indistinct. The cartoon face, the belt, the cheerful design that had appeared on 100,000 souvenirs, and it would have become simply a shape moving upward through the dark air above the stadium. The music continued below. The crowd watched, and there is something in the specific image of that moment, the ascending mascot, the ballad, the 100,000 people looking upward in the August night, that captures something about the way farewell operates at the scale of large collective events. The use of an object or a figure to carry the weight of parting upward and away, the music providing the emotional frame for the departure, the crowd the witness. Goodbye Moscow is not a song that circulates widely outside of Russia and the particular cultural context in which it was written. Its primary claim on the attention of anyone looking at the history of farewell music is that one specific night, the closing ceremony of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the bear rising through warm August air, the crowd below growing quieter as the mascot grew smaller. The song was written for a different purpose, and then that moment claimed it, and after that night the song was permanently associated with the image of the bear ascending, and the stadium below, and the crowd watching something depart slowly enough to keep watching until it was gone. There is a quality that all of these moments share, across the considerable differences of their circumstances and their scales. The radio signal moving through Saigon in the April heat, the voices rising at the Berlin Wall in the cold November dark, the organ music filling the frequency on a September Sunday morning while the country adjusted itself to what it had just been told, the musicians on the tilting deck in the North Atlantic, the bear ascending above the Moscow Stadium while a ballad played to 100,000 people. Each of these was a moment in which music was called upon to do something that words were not adequate to do alone. The music was not called upon to explain the moment. It was not called upon to resolve it, or to make it bearable, or to offer any reassurance that things would work out in a particular direction. It was called upon to acknowledge the moment, to be present in it with a quality of sound that was proportionate to the size of what was happening, and to fill the space between people with something that was recognizably human, and therefore in some way that is difficult to state precisely, but easy to feel, a form of company. What varies across these moments is the scale and the circumstance. What does not vary is the impulse. The musicians on the Titanic and the programmers at the BBC and the planners of the Moscow closing ceremony and whoever chose White Christmas as the signal for the Saigon evacuation were all making the same basic move, using music as a way of marking a moment of parting, of making audible the fact that something was ending and that the ending deserved to be heard, not only seen. The crowd at the Berlin Wall singing Freiheit in the cold November air was making the same move without any planning at all. The music arising because it was what the moment seemed to require, drawn out of the gathered voices by the specific weight of what they were inside. The selection of music in these moments is in each case revealing in its own way. The Bing Crosby recording was chosen for its ordinariness, for the way it could carry a signal inside the appearance of having no significance. The organ music on the BBC was chosen for its gravity and its associations with ceremony, the sound of an institution reaching for something adequate to the size of the moment. The Ode to Joy at the commemorations after the wall's fall was chosen for its capacity to expand, to fill the emotional space of a historical change with a melody large enough to meet it. The Russian ballad at the Moscow closing ceremony was chosen for its valedictory quality, the specific shape of a melody that knows something is ending and says so without argument. And the musicians on the Titanic chose nothing, or chose everything they knew, or simply continued doing the thing they knew how to do in the situation they were in, and the music they played in those final hours was in its own way the most direct version of all of these. Music as presence, music as the continuation of something human in a moment when the human was very much at stake. The details of these events are specific, and they remain specific. The April heat of Saigon, the cold of the Berlin night, the particular sound of the organ through a living room radio on a September morning, the tilting deck and the cold Atlantic air, the bear ascending through the warm dark above the Moscow stadium. Each detail belongs to a particular moment and a particular group of people for whom that moment was immediate and real and irreversible. But the structure underneath the details is older than any of these events, and it is the same structure in all of them. The human reaching for music at the moment of parting, the sound going out into whatever air is available, the people present receiving it and being in some way that matters, changed by the receiving. The bear grew smaller against the dark sky. The music continued in the stadium below, the Russian ballad filling the open air of the arena, the melody rising and falling with the specific patience of a piece written for exactly this kind of moment. The crowd watched the ascending shape, and the shape grew smaller, and the music continued, and the night was warm, and the stadium was full of people watching something depart, and the watching was itself a kind of farewell, the holding of the gaze as something moves away, the willingness to keep looking until the thing is fully gone, the music providing the measure of that looking, steady and unhurried, as the bear moved through the August air and grew smaller and smaller against the sky, and the song continued, and the crowd remained, watching for as long as there was something to watch. Arnold van Gennep worked at a table covered in papers. The papers were handwritten, many of them copied from fieldwork accounts and translated reports and ethnographic records gathered from places as different from one another as it is possible for places on Earth to be. He was working in the early years of the 20th century, and what he was doing, in the slow and methodical way of someone who has noticed something and cannot yet say with certainty what it means, was comparing ceremonies, funeral rites from West Africa, marriage transitions from Melanesia, coming-of-age rituals from North America, harvest ceremonies from the rural villages of France. He was reading across them, column by column, and the thing that was happening, the thing that must have produced, somewhere in the process, a particular quality of stillness in the room, was that the same shape kept appearing, not the same music, not the same words, not the same costumes or offerings or spoken formulae, but underneath all of that surface variation, the same three movements in the same order with a reliability that no single cultural influence could explain. Separation came first, then a middle stage, a threshold, a suspended time that was neither before nor after, but precisely and uncomfortably between. then incorporation, the moment of return, when the person or the group was received into a new condition and the ceremony closed. Van Gennep called these three stages the rites of passage. He published his findings in 1909 in a book of the same name, and the framework he described has held up in the century and more since it appeared, because the pattern it identified was not an artifact of the cultures he happened to study. It was something structural, something that seemed to be built into the way human beings experience and manage the fact of change. What is interesting about that pattern, considered from the quiet distance of a dark room where sleep is not far off, is not that it appears in elaborate ceremony. It is that it appears in the smallest goodbyes as well. The long conversation at the door before parting, the second hug that neither person quite initiated, the return to the car window to say something that had already been said. The human body, it seems, resists the sharp edge of ending. It circles the moment of goodbye, the way water circles a drain, drawn toward it, but reluctant to go through. Van Gennep's middle stage had its own name. He called it the liminal phase, from the Latin word for threshold. The liminal moment is the one in which something has already ended and something else has not yet begun. The moment between the last note and the silence, between the person's presence and their absence, between the life that was and whatever comes after. It is an uncomfortable place to be, and human cultures across every tradition have developed elaborate methods for filling it, for making it bearable, for giving it a texture that the body can rest against. Music is one of those methods. It has been one of the most consistent. The anthropologist Victor Turner built on Van Gennep's framework 60 years later, in a book published in 1969 called The Ritual Process. Turner was interested specifically in what happens to people during that threshold time, not just structurally, but socially and emotionally. What he found, across his own fieldwork and in the broader anthropological record, was that the liminal phase has a distinctive effect on the groups who move through it together. Social hierarchies tend to loosen. The distinctions that ordinarily organize people, status, rank, age, wealth, become less operative during the ceremony. Turner called this communitas. It is a particular kind of solidarity that arises not from shared belief or shared identity, but from shared threshold, from the fact of standing together in the uncomfortable middle place and finding that the others are also there. Music, Turner observed, is one of the most reliable producers of communitas, a group of people who might not otherwise move in the same social circles, who might not speak easily to one another across whatever ordinary distances organize their lives, will find those distances temporarily dissolved when they are standing in the same room singing the same song. The melody does not care about the distinctions. The voices that join it do not require anything of one another except the breath to sustain the phrase. And in that shared breath, for the duration of the song, something loosens that is otherwise held quite firmly. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a social one, documented carefully by researchers who were watching groups of people move through transitions and noting what changed and what remained. The loosening that Turner described is real and measurable in the sense that the behaviors it produces, the spontaneous embrace between strangers at a graveside, the voices of people who have never met joining without prompting on a second verse, are observable. The music opens a space. People enter it. What they find there is something they could not have arranged by other means. A group of people standing at the end of a gathering that is ending will sometimes do something that is not quite explained by any practical necessity. The coats are on. The conversation has reached its natural stopping point. One person moves toward the door and then turns back. Another finds something to say. The circle forms again, more loosely, and the talking resumes at a lower energy. Not because there is anything left to say, but because crossing the threshold means the goodbye has actually happened. Turner's framework would recognize this. The liminal phase is being prolonged, unconsciously and collectively, because entering the next stage requires surrendering the one that is ending, and the body knows what that means, even when the mind is busy with something else. The biological architecture underneath all of this is older than any ceremony. The developmental psychologist John Bowlby spent decades documenting what happens to children when they are separated from the people they depend on, and what he found was a sequence so consistent across populations and circumstances that he came to believe it was not learned behavior, but something closer to a biological given. Protest came first, the immediate, urgent, often loud resistance to the separation, the reaching and crying, and refusal to accept what is happening. Despair followed, a quieter state, a kind of subdued withdrawal after the protest had run its course without producing reunion. Detachment came last, a protective adaptation, a reorganizing of the self around the fact of the absence.
Bowlby described these three phases in terms of evolutionary advantage.
The protest phase, he argued, exists because in the environment in which human beings evolved, protest sometimes worked. Calling for the caregiver, signaling distress loudly and persistently, increased the probability of reunion. The body that protested had better odds of survival than the body that accepted loss quietly. Despair and detachment were adaptations for when the protest had failed, ways of conserving energy, of surviving the separation without being consumed by it. The sequence, from this angle, is not a sign of fragility. It is a sign of a very old and very practical system doing exactly what it was built to do. What this means for farewell is worth sitting with. The impulse to resist parting, to linger at the door, to turn back once, to find one more thing to say, is not social awkwardness. It is the protest phase operating in the register appropriate to an adult human life. The body has not forgotten what it knew when it was very small, that separation is a serious event, that it carries weight, that the person who was here and is now not here leaves a specific shape of absence behind them. All the elaborate ritual of human farewell, the music, the ceremony, the formal gathering and dispersal, is built, in some sense, around that original biological fact. The cortisol research makes this tangible in a different way. Prolonged situations of farewell produce measurable changes in the hormonal environment of the body. Cortisol, which is released in response to stress, rises during extended partings, and what the social psychologist James Pennebaker found in his research on emotional disclosure is that structured farewell rituals, ceremonies that give the goodbye a clear shape, a beginning and a middle and an end, with music playing at the appropriate moments, can reduce that cortisol elevation relative to goodbyes that are interrupted or left incomplete. The ceremony is doing physiological work. The song is doing physiological work, not metaphorically but measurably, in the specific chemistry of the bodies present in the room. This is not a small thing. It suggests that the human impulse toward ritual at the moment of parting is not merely expressive, not just a way of communicating feeling, but regulatory. The ceremony does something to the nervous system that the absence of ceremony does not do. The music helps the body move through a transition that the body would otherwise resist more violently, at greater physiological cost. The slow tempo, the familiar melody, the voices joining, these are not decorative additions to a moment that would be equally complete without them. They are part of the mechanism. Ethnomusicologists have documented something that fits alongside this finding with a kind of quiet precision. Bruno Nettel and Alan Merriam, working across large bodies of fieldwork from geographically and historically unconnected musical traditions, identified a pattern in farewell and mourning music that holds with unusual consistency. The tempos are slow, not slow in the way that a particular culture might prefer slow music, but slow in a way that aligns across traditions that had no contact with one another, that developed their musical practices independently over centuries with a specific physiological reference point, the resting heart rate. Music played at around 60 beats per minute or below matches the rhythm at which a calm, resting body beats. Farewell music, across dozens of traditions from different continents and different centuries, clusters in this range. The dirge, the lament, the slow processional, the elegy. These are not slow because sadness is conventionally depicted as slow, or not only because of that. They are slow because the body that is grieving or parting is in a particular physiological state, and the music that travels with it mirrors that state, meets the body where it is, matches its rhythm, and in matching it, produces something closer to regulation than to agitation. A Balinese cremation ceremony is not, on its surface, a quiet event. It is elaborate and populous and loud, with percussive music and bright color and communal participation on a scale that a quiet Western funeral would find almost unrecognizable. The crowds are large. The preparations are extensive. The ceremony itself is a significant social and economic undertaking for the families involved, and it is designed to be so. The scale is part of the meaning. And yet, underneath everything that distinguishes it from a graveside service in a cold northern country, the same structure is present. There is a formal acknowledgement that someone is leaving. There is a gathered community. There is music calibrated to the solemnity of the transition, even if that calibration sounds different in Bali than it does in Birmingham. The three stages Van Janep identified are visible if one knows where to look: the protest in a different register, the threshold, the incorporation of the absence into the ongoing life of the community. The specific sounds are different, the instruments are different, the beliefs that give the ceremony its meaning are different, shaped by cosmologies that are not interchangeable and should not be flattened into similarity for the sake of a neat comparison. But the act, the formal, communal, music-accompanied acknowledgement that someone who was here is no longer here, and that this requires marking, that act is the same. It appears in every culture that has been documented in any depth. It appears in the oldest records humans have left of their own behavior. It appears in some form in communities so geographically isolated that their ritual practices could not have been borrowed or transmitted from any common source. This consistency is one of the most interesting things the anthropological record contains, not because it proves that all humans feel the same things. It does not prove that, and the differences in how grief is expressed and managed across cultures are real and significant, but because it suggests that whatever is underneath the ritual, whatever need the ceremony is built to address, is not culturally specific. It is something the body brings to every culture it inhabits, and every culture finds some way to answer it. Music is the most common answer. Not the only one, but the most common. And the reason for that consistency, which is something that researchers in psychoacoustics and neuroscience and ethnomusicology have approached from different directions without quite converging on a single explanation, is probably not singular. Music does several things at once. It regulates the tempo of the group's collective movement through the liminal phase. It creates communitas, dissolving the ordinary social distances. It gives the body something rhythmic and patterned to move with, which is itself a form of physiological regulation. It encodes the emotional experience of the moment in a way that can be retrieved later, a way for the memory of the goodbye to remain accessible, carried in the sound of a melody that will arrive again without warning, years afterward, and return everything. The hippocampus is shaped roughly like a seahorse. It sits inside the temporal lobe, one on each side of the brain, and among its many functions is the binding of memory, the process by which the sensory details of an experience are woven together and stored. The quality of light in a room, the temperature of the air, the sound playing in the background. The hippocampus binds these into a single coherent record and holds it. And when one element of the record is encountered again, the song, the smell, the specific angle of afternoon light, it can retrieve the whole. The memory arrives not as information, but as experience, with its original emotional texture largely intact. This is why a song heard at a moment of parting does not become an ordinary piece of music afterward. It becomes a door. Playing it is not like reading a description of a room. It is more like stepping into the room, briefly and without warning, with enough of the original sensory detail present that the body responds before the mind has fully arrived. The amygdala, which registers the emotional significance of experience and participates in encoding it into long-term memory, has been involved from the beginning. The memory is not neutral, it carries its charge. Oliver Sacks documented something about this that is worth holding for a moment. In his work with patients who had Alzheimer's disease, a condition in which autobiographical memory is progressively lost, in which the names of loved ones and the sequence of one's own life can become inaccessible, he found that music memory behaved differently from other kinds of memory. Songs that a patient had known for a long time, pieces that carried significant emotional weight, remained accessible after other memories had gone. A person who could no longer reliably name family members might still recognize and respond to a song they had known in early life. The melody was still there. The emotional response it carried was still there. What this suggests about the hippocampus and about the specific way music is encoded is that farewell music, music heard at moments of significant parting, bound by the hippocampus to the full sensory and emotional texture of that moment, may be among the most durably held memories the brain contains. The goodbye itself may fade into abstraction, may become a story told in the third person, may lose the specific quality of being present in it, but the song that played at the goodbye remains, and when it is heard again, something of the original moment comes back with it. In a quiet examination room, a patient with advanced Alzheimer's sits in a chair beside a window. The light comes in at a low angle. A researcher or a clinician or a family member puts on a recording, something from the patient's past, a song that was meaningful, a melody connected to a specific time in a specific life. And the hippocampus, that small seahorse-shaped structure that has held the binding of memory through decades of a human life, shows activity on the scan. It is still there. The song is still reaching it. The emotional trace of whatever that song once carried is still present in the tissue, still responsive to the sound, still capable of being found by the melody that originally wrote it. There is something in that image that is neither sad nor triumphant. It is simply what it is, the record of a fact about how the brain works, observed in a room with careful instruments, noted down. The music is still moving through the structure of the brain. The farewell, the song once accompanied, is still there, in some form held inside the tissue, in the way that an impression is held in soft material, the shape of what pressed against it, still visible, still true to the original contact. The slowness of farewell music is not accidental, 60 beats per minute, below resting heart rate, or aligned with it. The dirge moves at the pace of a body at rest, and the body that is grieving or parting is being met at its own pace, guided rather than pulled, accompanied rather than instructed. The tempo says, "Here is where you are," and the body, which was already there, finds in the music's agreement a kind of relief that is not quite comfort, but is something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that the slowness is appropriate, that it is allowed to be this slow. Pennebaker's research on cortisol and structured ritual pointed towards something that researchers in hospice settings have continued to elaborate. The body does not simply stop responding to its environment as it approaches the end of life. It continues to regulate, continues to respond, continues to be shaped by what is present in the room. Music therapists working in hospice settings, sitting beside beds, adjusting tempo to match changing breath, moving with the patient's rhythm rather than imposing a rhythm from outside, are not performing for the dying. They are participating in a process of regulation that the body is still capable of, still engaged in, all the way to the last breath. The tempo adjustment is the key detail there. A music therapist who is good at this work is not playing a fixed piece at a fixed speed and waiting for it to finish. The therapist is listening to the breath, to the quality of movement in the room, to the specific physiological state of the person they are playing for, and adjusting in response. The music becomes responsive. It becomes a conversation in which one party speaks through breath and the other through sound, and the agreement between them is a kind of care that clinical language can describe but not quite capture. The brain, receiving that music, is doing what it has always done. It is binding. It is responding. It is finding in the melody something that the amygdala recognizes as significant, and somewhere in the tissue, the record is being made. Even here, even now, the hippocampus holds what it can hold. The music moves through the structure of the listening mind, the way it always has, carrying tempo, carrying pitch, carrying the emotional freight that is accumulated in the song over a lifetime of hearing it, and the body receives it. Van Gennep, at his table in the early 1900s, was watching something that the biology had been doing for a very long time before anyone had the tools to describe it at the level of tissue and chemistry. The need to mark the threshold, the need to be in the company of others at the moment of crossing, the need for music, specifically for slow and patterned and familiar sound, to fill the liminal space and give the body something to move with. These needs appear in the fieldwork records from every tradition he examined, and they appear again in the neuroscience and the psychoneuroendocrinology and the hospice research approached from a completely different direction, with completely different instruments arriving at findings that fit the same underlying shape. The pattern did not require any single culture to invent it. It required only the body, that particular arrangement of tissue and nerve and biochemistry that human beings have in common, regardless of the ceremony they have been taught to perform. The body brought the need. The cultures built the ceremony, and the ceremony, whatever form it took, wherever it appeared, found music, found it again and again across distances of geography and time that should have made any such convergence unlikely, found it the way water finds the lowest available path, not by intention, but by the operation of something structural and patient and very, very old. What remains, after all the fieldwork has been read and the neuroscience has been noted and the anthropological categories have done their careful work, is something simpler. The moment of parting is real. The absence that follows it is real.